The seat was first class, the challenge was public, and the woman being forced to stand was the Mafia boss's wife. The moment Becky Miller's voice exploded through the first-class cabin, passengers knew something had gone wrong, but none of them understood how badly. "That seat is mine," Becky shouted, gripping the armrest of seat 3B. "I don't care what her boarding pass says." Phones were already up. The engines hummed beneath the floor. Pushback clearance was minutes away. Simone Zhao stood calmly in the aisle, perfectly still, as the white passenger leaned toward her with a smile that wasn't friendly. It was territorial. The kind of smile that assumed the outcome had already been decided. What Becky didn't realize was that this wasn't just a seat dispute. This was the moment she crossed a line airlines quietly fear. Simone didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't explain who she was married to or why her name never appeared on manifests. She simply waited. Becky laughed loudly, gesturing toward Simone's tailored dress. "First class isn't for people who look like they wandered in by mistake," she said, making sure the cameras caught it. "Don't pretend you belong up here." The words landed heavy, familiar, weaponized. A flight attendant stepped in, hesitant, eyes darting between the ticking clock and the growing crowd. The captain's door remained closed, but not for long. "If you've ever seen entitlement mistaken for power, stay with this, because this escalates fast." Simone was asked to step aside, to avoid disruption, to keep the peace. She did, and that was the point of no return. As Simone walked past the rows of raised phones toward the back of the cabin, a quiet signal left her device. No call, no text, just a trigger, one designed for moments airlines pray never happen. Somewhere far beyond the cabin, systems woke up. Systems that didn't argue, didn't shout, and didn't forgive. Watch closely, because what happens next isn't loud, but it's final. Becky smirked, basking in the attention, already narrating her version of the story in her head. She had no idea that this wasn't the first time she'd been flagged, or that every second since her outburst was being logged. The doors were still open, the clock was still counting, and the flight she thought she controlled was seconds away from never leaving the gate. The boarding door had barely closed when Becky Miller decided the seat belonged to her. She stood in the aisle of first class like she'd been planted there, hand gripping the leather headrest of seat 3B, chin lifted, voice already loud enough to draw eyes from 3 rows away. Simone Zhao was still settling in, purse placed neatly beneath the seat, posture relaxed, when Becky leaned closer and said it again, slower this time, as if volume could bend reality. "That's my seat." Simone looked up, calm and unhurried. Around them, the cabin shimmered with quiet luxury. Cream leather, polished brass, the low murmur of people who paid to never be disturbed. This space was designed for discretion. Becky shattered it effortlessly. "I think there's been a mistake," Simone said evenly, lifting her boarding pass. "This is 3B." Becky didn't look at the paper. She laughed, sharp and performative, the kind of laugh meant for an audience. Phones rose almost instinctively. Becky's eyes flicked toward them, then back to Simone, measuring her like an object misfiled. "No," she said. "The mistake is you thinking you belong here." The words weren't new. They were old enough to carry history in their weight. Becky gestured broadly at Simone's clothes, her hair the way she stood. "First class is expensive. People up here look the part." Simone felt the familiar shift, the moment a private insult became a public test. The cabin leaned in. Silence thickened. A flight attendant approached, smile already strained. "Ladies, let's just take a look at the boarding passes." Becky waved her off. "You don't need to. I fly this route all the time. She's clearly in the wrong place." "Clearly?" Simone handed over her boarding pass anyway. The attendant scanned it, paused, scanned again. The screen confirmed what Simone already knew. Seat 3B, assigned. Paid for. The attendant hesitated. That hesitation said everything. Becky leaned closer, voice dropping just enough to sound reasonable. "Do we really want to delay boarding over this?" she said, loud enough for others to hear. "We're already behind schedule. Just move her. Coach is full of empty seats." Simone watched the decision form before it was spoken. Not because she was wrong, but because she was easier. "Ma'am," the attendant said quietly to Simone, "would you be willing to step aside for a moment while we sort this out?" There it was. The theft, disguised as courtesy. Simone nodded once. She stood, smoothing her dress, lifting her bag without hurry. Becky smiled as if she'd won something. As Simone stepped into the aisle, past the raised phones and curious stares, the engines deepened their hum. Pushback was imminent. Time compressed. Becky slid into Seat 3B like it had always been hers, already tapping at her phone, already narrating a victory. Simone walked toward the back of the cabin, her face composed, her silence intact. And somewhere beyond the plane, the first invisible door quietly closed behind Becky Miller, locking her into an outcome she could no longer escape. The aisle felt longer than it had a moment ago. Simone moved through it at an even pace, shoulders back, steps unhurried, as though nothing had changed. But the cabin had shifted. The quiet luxury of first class thinned behind her, replaced by the dense awareness of eyes tracking her movement. Phones were already raised. She didn't look at them, but she felt them. Small, glowing rectangles aimed like lenses in a courtroom. Whispers followed in her wake, fragments catching the air. "Did she really try to take that seat?" "Someone said she scanned the wrong boarding pass." "Why is she walking back here?" None of them knew, and none of them asked. Simone passed row 6, then 7, the boundary where first class ended and something else began. The seats tightened, the lighting dulled, space itself felt rationed. This was where people were meant to sit quietly and not draw attention. Behind her, Becky's laughter floated forward, bright and victorious. It made something in Simone's chest tighten, not with anger, but with clarity. She had seen this before. Different faces. Same posture. The certainty that volume could rewrite truth. A man leaned into the aisle as Simone passed, phone held openly now. He didn't bother to hide it. "This is wild," he muttered, already narrating for whoever was watching him live. "First-class drama before takeoff." Another passenger shook her head, lips pursed, judgment without evidence, comfort in consensus. Simone reached her assigned temporary seat near the back, middle, narrow, boxed in by strangers who shifted away as she approached. One of them glanced at her, then quickly at the phone in her own hand, as if proximity itself might be contagious. "Sorry," the woman whispered, not quite meeting Simone's eyes. Simone nodded and sat. The seat felt smaller than it should have been. Her knees pressed close. The armrests were already claimed. She folded her hands neatly in her lap, breathing once, slow and controlled. Around her, screens refreshed. Clips were already being trimmed, captions written before context could catch up. "Entitled woman kicked out of first class, caught trying to steal a seat. This is why they need stricter boarding." Simone didn't correct them. She reached into her bag and took out her phone. No shaking hands, no visible reaction. Just one deliberate movement, a sequence memorized long ago. She pressed, swiped, and stopped. That was all. The engines deepened their growl. Overhead bins clicked shut. A voice crackled over the intercom, announcing final preparations for departure. Simone stared straight ahead as the cabin settled, her reflection faint in the darkened screen of the seatback in front of her. They thought the story had ended when she sat down. They didn't realize it had only just begun. Simone didn't rush. That was the detail no one noticed. In a cabin buzzing with whispers and notifications, she moved with deliberate calm, eyes steady, breathing measured. Her phone rested lightly in her hand, screen dark, as if it were nothing more than a comfort object. To anyone watching, it looked like a woman trying to ground herself after public embarrassment. They were wrong. She waited for the signal she could feel more than hear, the subtle shift in the aircraft's rhythm, the moment when procedures locked in and assumptions hardened. Overhead bins snapped shut. The aisle cleared. The last of the boarding crew hurried forward. Only then did Simone turn her phone face up. The action was small. A thumbprint, a swipe, a pause that lasted less than a second. No message appeared. No call was placed. There was no dramatic typing, no visible distress. If anyone had been watching closely, and no one was, they would have seen nothing worth recording. But the phone vibrated once in her palm. Confirmation. Somewhere far beyond the cabin, a system acknowledged her presence. Not by name, never by name. Names created trails. This system worked on identifiers that didn't change. Biometrics, clearance tiers, patterns of movement that triggered concern not because of who you were, but because of what had just happened to you. Simone locked the screen and slipped the phone back into her bag. Around her, the cabin carried on, unaware. Becky's voice drifted faintly from the front, laughter spilling as she replayed the moment for an unseen audience. Flight attendants moved briskly now, relieved that the disruption had been contained. The captain ran through his checklist, already thinking past this flight to the next. They believed the situation had been resolved. The alert didn't disagree. It didn't argue. It didn't escalate. Yet. It simply changed the status of the flight. Simone sat quietly as the engines spooled higher, the vibration deepening beneath her feet. Outside the window, the ground crew finished their choreography, orange vests flashing as they cleared the tarmac. She knew what would happen next, not in detail, but in shape. She had learned long ago not to expect drama from power that worked properly. It never announced itself. It just arrived. A chime sounded softly in her bag. Not urgent, not loud. Easy to miss. Simone didn't check it. She didn't need to. Somewhere in a control room she would never see, a file had opened. A timeline had begun assembling itself. Video, audio, passenger data, prior incidents, patterns. The aircraft sat ready, heavy with fuel and certainty. Simone folded her hands again and looked forward, composed as ever. The message had been sent, and nothing that followed would be accidental. Becky Miller didn't notice the shift. From seat 3B, she was already crafting the story in her head, angling her phone just right, so the cabin lights softened her features, and the leather headrest sat clearly behind her, like proof. First class looked good on camera. That mattered. She tapped record. Okay, so this just happened, Becky began, voice trembling in a way she had practiced. I literally just boarded my flight and had to deal with someone trying to take my seat. I'm shaking. She glanced toward the aisle, making sure the frame caught the empty space where Simone had stood minutes earlier. A victory shot. She nodded slowly, as if reliving the trauma. I hate confrontation, she continued, eyes flicking to the screen to check engagement. But some people think rules don't apply to them, and when you speak up, suddenly you're the bad guy. Comments began to roll in almost instantly. Hearts, fire emojis, messages of support stacking faster than she could read them. You did the right thing. Why do airlines let this happen? They should ban people who try that. Becky sighed, the sound heavy with relief and righteousness. The flight attendants handled it, she said. Thank God. I just don't feel safe when things like that happen. She angled the camera toward the front of the cabin, careful not to show faces. First class is supposed to be calm. You pay for that peace. The irony didn't occur to her. A woman across the aisle shifted uncomfortably, turning her face toward the window. Becky didn't notice. Her focus was locked on the screen, on the numbers climbing, on the validation pouring in. She ended the video with a soft smile. "Anyway, I'm okay. Thanks for checking in. I'll update you guys after takeoff." After takeoff. She hit post and leaned back, exhaling. The adrenaline faded into satisfaction. This would trend. It always did. Conflict made good content, especially when she controlled the narrative. She opened a second app, scrolling through messages from followers asking for details, urging her to tell the truth, to stand her ground. Becky replied with quick thumbs and hearts, feeding the loop she knew so well. Somewhere behind her, a flight attendant paused mid-step, brow furrowing as a message appeared on her device. She glanced toward the cockpit, then back at Becky, then down the aisle toward the back of the plane. Becky missed it. She was already drafting the follow-up. A longer post, more context. A version of events where she was calm, reasonable, forced into action by someone else's audacity. The engines continued their steady hum. The cabin lights dimmed slightly, preparing for departure. Becky smiled to herself, phone warm in her hand, convinced she had won something. She had no idea her performance had just been archived, not by her followers, but by systems that didn't care how good she looked on camera, and they were far less forgiving than the internet. Simone had learned long ago that real power rarely announced itself. It moved quietly, through absence rather than presence, through the things people avoided saying out loud. Even now, seated near the back of the aircraft, she could feel it settling into place. Not like a threat, but like gravity. No one spoke his name. They didn't need to. Somewhere in the front cabin, a flight attendant lowered her voice while speaking into a handset, words chosen carefully, pauses stretching just a fraction too long. Another attendant stood near the cockpit door, posture stiff, eyes forward, as if waiting for instructions she hadn't been trained to receive. Simone watched it all without turning her head. She had seen this pattern unfold in boardrooms, in hotel lobbies, in places where people thought they were in control until they weren't. The moment when confidence thinned into caution. When certainty gave way to quiet recalculation. Victor Zhao existed in those moments, not as a man, but as a consideration. Simone remembered the first time she understood what his name carried, how conversations changed shape when it hovered nearby, how people smiled more carefully, how decisions were suddenly revisited without explanation. Victor never needed to raise his voice. He didn't even need to be present. Neither did she. A subtle tremor ran through the cabin, not turbulence, but hesitation. The engines idled instead of surging. Time stretched. The departure clock ticked past its mark without announcement. Simone folded her hands, composed, eyes forward. She wondered if Becky had noticed yet. From the front, laughter faltered. Becky's voice dipped, then rose again, trying to reclaim its earlier certainty. But something had changed. The attention she thrived on had shifted elsewhere, pulled forward toward the cockpit, toward unseen conversations happening behind closed doors. A murmur rippled through the rows. Not words. Tone. Confusion. Questions that didn't quite form. "Why aren't we moving?" someone whispered. A flight attendant passed quickly, avoiding eye contact, her expression unreadable. Simone felt no satisfaction, no anticipation, just a familiar stillness. Victor had taught her that this was the moment most people misunderstood. They expected fireworks, threats, men in suits rushing down aisles. That was never how it worked. Instead, there would be pauses, verifications, quiet confirmations passed between people who understood the cost of being wrong. Somewhere, a file would be opened. Somewhere else, a name would be recognized and then deliberately not spoken aloud. The aircraft remained at the gate, engines humming softly, restrained by nothing visible. Simone sat patiently, her presence unchanged. The shadow had arrived, and everything was already moving around it. The call came through the cockpit without warning, It wasn't loud. It didn't blare or interrupt the captain mid-sentence. It slipped into the workflow like it belonged there, an extra line on a screen, a soft chime that meant stop without using the word. Captain Harris frowned. They were already behind schedule. Pushback clearance had been granted. The engines were stable, the cabin secure. This wasn't the moment for new information. He leaned closer to the display, reading it once, then again. A security directive. Priority, elevated. Action, hold position. He didn't announce it. He didn't need to. His hand lifted, palm out, and the first officer froze, checklist unfinished. The cockpit went still. "That's not standard," the first officer said quietly. "No," Harris replied. "It isn't." He scrolled. The message carried no explanation, only instructions and an identifier that made his jaw tighten. Not a passenger name, not a seat number, a classification code reserved for situations most captains only heard about in training. Harris exhaled slowly and picked up the interphone. "Ground," he said evenly. "Confirm hold. We're not moving." There was a pause on the other end. Too long. "Confirmed," came the reply, tone carefully neutral. "Remain at gate." Harris set the handset down and stared forward through the cockpit glass. The runway lights glowed patiently in the distance, waiting for an aircraft that would not arrive. Behind him, the cabin crew waited for direction, eyes searching his posture for answers. He gave none. He adjusted his cap, straightened in his seat. "All right," he said at last, voice calm. "Let's slow this down." The engines remained at idle. The clock continued its quiet accusation. In the cabin, confusion began to ripple. Passengers checked watches. A few glanced toward the windows, expecting movement that didn't come. A flight attendant tapped lightly on the cockpit door. "Captain?" she asked, keeping her voice low. "We're getting questions." "I'm aware," Harris said. "Tell them we're waiting on clearance." She hesitated. "Is there an issue?" Harris thought of the code again, of the way it bypassed normal channels, arrived without explanation, demanded compliance without justification. "Yes," he said carefully. "There is." She nodded and stepped back, already rehearsing a softer version for the cabin. Harris turned to his first officer. "I want all logs preserved," he said. "Video, audio, the lot." The first officer blinked. "Sir?" "Just do it." Another message appeared on the screen, then another, each one tightening the circle. Whatever had started in first class was no longer contained there. The captain folded his hands, gaze steady. The flight wasn't delayed. It had been intercepted. The jolt never came. Passengers felt it before they understood it. The absence of motion where it should have been. The subtle lurch forward that signaled departure never arrived. Instead, the aircraft sat heavy and unmoving, engines idling in a prolonged hum that stretched from seconds into minutes. Wheels locked. A chime sounded overhead, followed by the captain's voice, measured, controlled, too calm to be reassuring. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to be holding at the gate for a few moments. Please remain seated." A few moments passed. Then more. Seatbelts clicked open and shut again as people shifted, checking watches, refreshing feeds. The aisle filled with questions that didn't quite reach volume yet. "Did we miss our slot?" "I thought we were cleared." "What's going on?" From seat 3B, Becky Miller frowned. She stopped replying to comments and looked toward the window, then toward the front, irritation creeping into her expression. This wasn't part of the plan. Delays ruined momentum. Delays killed engagement. She leaned into the aisle. "Excuse me," she called to a passing attendant. "Why aren't we moving?" The attendant smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "We're waiting on clearance, ma'am." But we already had clearance, Becky pressed. Yes, the attendant said gently. And now we're waiting. The words carried finality. Another announcement followed, shorter this time. For everyone's safety, please remain seated. Doors will remain closed. Doors sealed. That was when the mood changed. People noticed the stillness, the way ground crew no longer approached the plane, the way the jet bridge, once bustling, now stood empty. A few passengers near the windows pointed it out quietly, unease threading through their voices. In the back, Simone Zhao sat exactly as she had before, hands folded, gaze forward. Nothing about her posture suggested anticipation or fear. She looked like someone who understood waiting. A flight attendant moved briskly toward the front, then stopped short, receiving a message on her device. Her shoulders stiffened. She glanced back down the aisle, past the rows of passengers, until her eyes briefly found Simone. She looked away just as quickly. Becky noticed the glance. Her phone buzzed again. Not comments this time. A message from the airline app. Your departure has been delayed. What? Becky muttered under her breath. She checked the time. This wasn't normal. She started recording again, but stopped halfway through, uncertainty creeping in. The cabin lights dimmed slightly. Not the soft dimming of takeoff, but the kind meant to settle people into place. Somewhere forward, a door clicked shut with deliberate finality. The plane was no longer waiting to leave. It was being held. And as the minutes stretched on, one thing became clear to everyone aboard. Whatever had happened back in first class hadn't ended when the seat was taken. It had only begun to take effect. The knock came from outside the aircraft, not the casual tap of a gate agent or the hurried signal of ground crew, but something heavier, deliberate, official. Conversations died mid-sentence. Through the cabin windows, passengers saw movement where there hadn't been any for minutes. Two figures approached along the jet bridge, followed by another in a darker uniform. Their pace was unhurried. Certain. A flight attendant straightened, smoothing her uniform as the cockpit door opened. The captain stepped out, expression unreadable, eyes scanning the cabin once before settling forward. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, voice calm but firm. Please remain seated. The door opened. Security boarded. They didn't announce themselves. They didn't raise their voices. One stood near the cockpit, another halfway down the aisle, quietly positioning themselves where everyone could see them. A ripple of shock moved through the cabin. Becky Miller's smile vanished. She sat up straighter, phone halfway lifted, then slowly lowered it as one of the officers stopped beside her row. He didn't look at her at first. He glanced at a tablet in his hand, scrolling with practiced ease. Ms. Miller, he said at last. Becky laughed, short and brittle. Is there a problem? Yes, he replied. Several. Her eyes flicked toward the surrounding passengers, cameras already angling in her direction. This was supposed to be her moment, her narrative. The officer turned the tablet slightly, not enough for others to see, but enough for Becky to understand. Her breath caught. Multiple documented incidents, he continued evenly. Harassment complaints, prior warnings, 3 airlines, 2 formal bans under review. That's not, Becky began, voice rising. And, the officer added, cutting through her protest without raising his tone, this flight is under a security hold related to your actions prior to departure. The cabin was silent now. No whispers, no scrolling. Becky's face flushed. She tried to take my seat, she said, the words tumbling out. I did what anyone would do. The officer didn't respond to the justification. He looked up, gaze steady. Ma'am, you are being asked to gather your belongings. Gasps rippled outward. What? Becky snapped. You can't be serious. Another officer stepped forward, positioning himself just behind her seat. You'll be escorted off the aircraft." Becky looked toward the front, then the back, searching for support that wasn't there. Her followers were suddenly very far away. From her seat near the rear, Simone Zhao watched without expression. She didn't avert her gaze. She didn't smile. She didn't need to. Becky stood slowly, movements stiff, clutching her phone as if it might still save her. As she stepped into the aisle, the officer paused. "One more thing," he said, voice low. "Your public posts have been preserved." Becky froze. Every version. The words landed harder than any accusation. As she was led forward, past the same eyes that had watched Simone walk back earlier, the cabin remained perfectly still. This time, no one filmed. They didn't need to. The reckoning was already complete. The cabin didn't celebrate. There was no applause, no murmured approval, no satisfying swell of sound to mark what had just happened. The silence that followed Becky Miller's removal was heavier than noise, a collective understanding settling into place. A flight attendant moved down the aisle toward Simone, her steps careful now, respectful in a way that hadn't been there before. She stopped beside her seat and lowered her voice. "Ms. Zhao," she said, "if you'll come with me." Simone rose smoothly, gathering her bag. She didn't look around as she stepped into the aisle. She didn't need to. The phones that had followed her walk earlier stayed lowered this time. Eyes dropped. Space opened. The walk forward felt different. Not because the plane had changed, but because the assumptions had. As Simone passed through the cabin, no one whispered. No one speculated. The path cleared without being asked. Authority had a way of rearranging rooms without announcing itself. When she reached first class, Seat 3B stood empty, its tray table folded neatly, the space returned to what it had always been. The attendant gestured quietly. "This is yours." Simone nodded once and sat. The leather felt cool beneath her hands. Familiar. Correct. Another attendant appeared moments later, offering water, then pausing just long enough to say, "We apologize for the inconvenience, ma'am." Not loudly, not performatively. The apology wasn't for the cabin. It was for her. Simone accepted it with a small inclination of her head. Around her, first class remained subdued. Conversations resumed cautiously, as if everyone were aware that something important had passed through the space and left a residue behind. People adjusted their posture, their tone. In the cockpit, final checks resumed. Clearance was reissued. The hold lifted as quietly as it had descended. The aircraft eased forward at last. As the wheels began their slow roll toward the runway, Simone looked ahead, hands folded, expression unchanged. To anyone watching now, she was simply another passenger who had reclaimed her seat. They would never know what hadn't been said, what hadn't been needed. The power had done its work without spectacle, without names, without threats. Seat 3B had never been the point. It was the order of things being restored, cleanly, decisively, and without asking for permission.